Hi everyone, hope you guys are doing well. This is James from Divine Crochet. Welcome to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to be doing a very in-depth beginner-friendly tutorial for this sweater vest. So, when I was first getting into crocheting garments, I gravitated very heavily towards making sweater vests. This is just because from my experience, you don't need an awful lot of crochet knowledge to be able to make something that you'll actually want to wear. The pattern that I'm sharing with you guys today only involves a single and a double crochet. As long as you can do those 2 stitches, you should be fine to make the whole thing. We're just going to be crocheting 2 panels and then sewing them together before then adding a few final touches. For the materials that you'll need to make this sweater vest, you'll first need 1 or 2 colours of yarn. You can choose any type of yarn. The thickness of your yarn is just going to influence whether your sweater vest is going to be kind of sheer and flowy, or if it's going to be a little bit more opaque and a little bit more cozy. And then whichever yarn you pick out, you just want to go ahead and pick a hook size that is around 1/2 millimeter larger than what is recommended for your yarn. This will just make your sweater vest drape really nicely and fit a lot better than if you were to use the recommended hook size. And then on top of that, you'll need a pair of scissors and a needle. And then because this might be your first crochet garment that you're making, you're also going to want to pick out something that you can use to determine the size that you need to make. You could either do this by using the measurements directly from your body. Alternatively, you could go ahead and find a piece of clothing that fits similarly to how you want this sweater vest to fit, and then use this as a reference to how big you want to make all of your dimensions. Before we get into this video, make sure you are subscribed and make sure you like and comment on this video if you enjoyed it. I share crochet content every week, and I'll also link all of my other social medias that I have in the description below. I also have an Etsy store where I sell written patterns if that's more your speed. I'll also leave that in the link below. Anyway, now we've gathered all of our materials, we're ready to start crocheting. So we're going to start off with the main colour that we want to use for our vest and leave a really long end, so around 1 meter, and 1 meter in is where we're going to do our slip knot. Now what we want to do is start off by chaining an odd number. Now, because we'll be adding some mesh stitches later which need an odd number of stitches to work on, that's why we're going to be building up an odd number. And the total length of this chain length should be how wide you want your sweater vest to be. Either compare this to the clothing garment you picked out for a size comparison or to your body. And once you're happy with the total length, you want to chain 2, skip 3 chain stitches from the hook, and into the 4th chain away from the hook, we're going to work in a double crochet. The 3 chains that we left out is going to act as a double crochet, so technically we have 2 stitches so far, but we're basically just going to carry on adding double crochets. Just go ahead and put 1 double crochet into each chain stitch. I'm currently working into the back bump of the chain, but wherever in the chain is easiest for you to work into, just go ahead and do that, because we'll be adding a border to this later on, so it doesn't actually have to look that pretty. Just make sure you're doing 1 double crochet into each one of the stitches. And I'm just adding my final double crochet here. Now is a good point to have another look at how wide you've made your sweater vest and double check that you're happy with how big it is. And if you are happy with how it's going, what we're going to do is chain 2, which is going to be our turning chain. Turn our work, and we're turning it in the direction that you would if you were reading a book in English. Then the chain 2 that has just come out of the double crochet below, we're going to skip that one and into the next available double crochet. That's where we're going to work in our double crochet. So remember earlier I said the chain 2 is counting as a stitch. You can see here that it just kind of stacks upon the last double crochet that we did in our first row of double crochets quite well. So we can just continue adding 1 stitch into each one of the stitches below. And we are going to continue doing this all the way up until we reach our final double crochet. So you can see here we have that double crochet, and then those 3 chains that we left out. Remember, the turning chains act as stitches, so our final double crochet needs to be into the turning chain. So it's going to be the top chain, so the chain that's right next to that double crochet. That's where we're going to work in our final double crochet. If you want, you can go ahead and count these stitches just to make sure that you have the same amount of stitches as the row below. And once you're happy with all of that, you can chain 2, turn your work, and repeat the process. Again, skipping the double crochet the chain 2 came out of and working a double crochet into the next available double crochet, and then after that it's just going to be 1 double crochet into each stitch up until the turning chain, and you want to build up a total of 8 rows. And it's at this point that we're going to change our yarn color. If you want to keep the same color, obviously you don't have to do this, and you could snip the yarn, but I want to keep the yarn floating on one side just so I reduce the amount of ends I have to sew in. Now it's time to introduce a new yarn color. So for me, I'm picking this cream, and we're going to start off with a slip knot on our hook, and we will do a single crochet into the last double crochet that we did. And if you see, I'm starting my first stitch where my last stitch was, so I'm replicating kind of the back and forth movement that you get with crochet, because obviously you turn your work every time you change your row if you're doing a panel like this. Your final single crochet should be in the second chain of the turning chain. Make sure you have the same amount of stitches before you then chain a total of 3 and turn your work. Now we're going to add our first mesh row, so skipping the single crochet the turning chain comes out of, as well as the one next to it, into the third single crochet we're going to work in a double crochet, then we're going to chain 1, then we're going to skip a single crochet in the row below before then doing a double crochet and chaining 1. So we're basically just working in a double crochet and a chain into every second single crochet, and we're going to be working all the way up until we put a double crochet into the first single crochet we made in the row below. At this point we can end this colour, so again I'm going to leave my yarn floating on the side, and I will turn my work, and here's where I can pick up my blue yarn to continue with my double crochets. If you're a beginner, I would just start and end each row. I'm just showing you here that I pull a loop through one of the V's on top, then I complete a normal slip stitch through the whole stitch like I normally would enter a double crochet, before I then start my work. And obviously you just want to pick whichever one works best for you, whether that's floating the yarn on one side or starting and ending your yarn each time you change a colour. But whichever one you do, you're just going to attach your yarn, chain 2, and into the chain next to the double crochet that we just worked into. That's where we're going to do our first double crochet. And from here we're going to be doing 1 double crochet into each stitch. So that's 1 double crochet into your double crochet and 1 into your chain stitch. But we're going to continue doing this all the way down the row, and what's going to happen is we're going to end our row on that chain 3. You want to do 1 double crochet into the third chain, and then finish off your row with 1 double crochet into the second chain, and this should give you the same amount of stitches that you had at the start. So I would go ahead and count your stitches to double check you haven't lost any or gained any, and then continue with a second row just like we were doing before of those double crochets. The one tip that I can give you if you are gaining or losing stitches at this point in the panel is that you want to make sure that your first double crochet is done in the second to last crochet you did on the row before. Then in between you just want to do 1 stitch into each stitch, and your final double crochet should go into the second chain you made at your turning chain. But anyway, we're basically going to alternate between doing those 6 rows of double crochets and then that mesh row, and then doing 2 rows of double crochets finishing off our yarn just like I showed you. And again, I'm floating my yarn on the side, you don't have to do this. We're then going to insert another mesh row using the same technique of starting off with a single crochet and then doing one single crochet into each stitch up until we reach the second chain of the turning chain in the row below. Chain 3, turn our work. Skip the single crochet that the chains come out of as well as the one next to it, and enter your triple crochet into the third to last single crochet that you did in the row below. Because I don't want to float the cream yarn, as I now need to do 8 rows in blue, I'm going to finish off my yarn here before then restarting my blue and continuing with a pattern of doing 8 rows of double crochets before I then introduce this single crochet, then the mesh stitch, and the 2 rows of double crochet, and then the repeat, and all of that jazz. When it comes to this repeat stitch, you could change around the numbers a little bit. So for example, if you're using a slightly larger hook size, you might want to reduce down the 8 rows of double crochets down to maybe 7 or 6. And if you're floating your yarn on one side, you're going to want to make sure that all of the rows of double crochets are going to be even numbers, so that will allow you to actually float your yarn. So for example, with the sweater vest that I'm making using double knit yarn, I changed the amount of rows from 8 to 6. Either way, you want to build up this panel up until the height of this panel is 2 inches beneath your armpit, all the way down to where you want the sweater vest to hit on your waist or hips. Once you've reached that point, we're ready to continue. So I'm happy with the total height of my sweater vest, so I'm going to finish my yarn here. And I would make sure that the next 2 rows are just double crochet rows, as we're going to be doing 2 decreases. So we have this curved part near our armpit before we then work our way up and then add a neckline to finish our panel. So we want to determine how wide we want the chest portion of this panel to be, and then we want to place this in the middle of our panel. So we should be able to count the amount of stitches either side and make sure that they're even. You could mark this with stitch markers if you would like, but for me, I just count the amount of stitches that I want to leave out. And the amount of stitches that you want to leave out either side should not only be the same as each other, but they should be both even numbers, because this will mean that the mesh stacks nicely on top of each other. In my case, I left a total of 8 stitches out each side, so I started off this panel by placing my hook through the 9th stitch from where I ended off, pulled a slip knot through that stitch, and then I slip stitched and tightened my yarn. So I've just reattached my yarn and I'm ready to chain 2. And what we're going to do here is a little bit different. We're going to skip the next available double crochet and go into the next double crochet. This is going to be how we start doing those decreases. So there are many ways we can decrease in crochet, but generally with this kind of project, this is going to be the easiest one for us to go with. But now we're going to do 1 double crochet up until we have those 8 stitches left, or however many you had left, plus 2. And so for me that would be 10 stitches left. And then I'm going to leave the 10th one blank and work my last double crochet into the 9th stitch. At this point, double check that you have an even amount of stitches either side that are left out before we then carry on with our next row. So we're going to chain 2 and turn our work before then skipping the stitch we came out of as well as the next available stitch, and work a double crochet into the 3rd to last double crochet that we did. And again, like we did in the row below, we're going to do 1 stitch into each stitch from here on out till we have our final 2 stitches, which should just be 1 double crochet and our chain 2. We're going to skip that double crochet and work our final double crochet into our chain 2 just here, or our second chain of our turning chain, I should probably say. But we've finished that, and that's going to be how we do our decreases. So I'm happy with just these 2 decreases. To be fair, I don't really think you should need many more than 2. So you just want to go ahead and continue with your pattern. So for me, I had 2 more rows to do of those double crochets to reach 8 rows of double crochets before I will then continue on with the mesh pattern. But what's going to happen is we're going to continue adding height to this all the way up until we reach where we want to add our neckline, which should be around 3 rows before we want to finish our panel. Again, either use your body as a reference for this by holding it up to your body, or compare it to a piece of clothing that you want to replicate the fit. But once you've reached that point, you want to determine how wide you want your neck to be and how wide you want your straps to be. So I ended up just kind of holding it up to my neck and comparing it like that, and I did stitches and then I skipped 1 stitch, did my final double crochet into the second double crochet, and at this point I wanted to double check that I was happy with the total size of the neck by replicating where the stitch would end on the other side, and I'm happy with it, so I'm going to continue by chaining 2, turning my work, skipping the stitch that the chain 2 came out of as well as the one next to it, and into that 3rd stitch. That's where we're going to do our second double crochet. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to be adding those 2 rows of decreases literally the exact same way that we did for underneath our armpits, and we're going to work in that row, and our final row is just going to be 1 stitch into each stitch. And I would recommend to probably do 3 rows either side of your panel to build up this collar, but obviously you could change this if you feel like you want to. But either way, once you've finished that 3rd row or your final row, just have a look at the slope and make sure you're happy with how everything looks before you then cut your yarn. And I leave enough so I could sew the top of this part together, so leave yourself a little bit of a generous end. And what we're going to do is mirror this on the other side by counting in from the outside inwards to the final stitch that you would have done. So I'm kind of mirroring the decreases that I did by doing a slip stitch and chaining 2 just like I did to start off my decreases. And you guessed it, just like we did before, we're going to chain 2, skip the stitch our chain 2 came out of as well as the one next to it, and then work in that double crochet just to mimic the decrease that we've already done. And then we'll work that row as normal, turning our panel and then skipping that double crochet and working our final double crochet into the 2nd chain of the turning chain, before then doing that final row how we normally would, where we do 1 stitch into each stitch, obviously apart from the double crochet that the chain 2 comes out of, as the chain 2 counts as a double crochet. And you just need to finish off this row and your panel will be done. And I know that it's a lot of information that I gave you, but hopefully it's a manageable amount of information. I would just double check by looking at everything that you're happy with it, and just double check that you're ready to move on. So now we have our panel done. You just want to go ahead and compare this to your body or to the piece of clothing that you're using for a size comparison, just to check that you're happy with all the dimensions that you've built, and just make sure that you're completely happy to continue. So assuming that you're happy with how everything looks and fits, we're just going to go ahead and make an exact identical copy of this panel. And what we're ready to do is get these 2 long ends and make sure that they're set either side of your panel and start sewing together the side of our project. Now I'm showing you 2 needles here which are both kind of the wrong size. Really I want something in between these 2, but when it comes to sewing in crochet, it's probably better to use a slightly bigger needle than a smaller needle, because you're not really going into the string so much as around the string. So the first place we're going to sew into is on our chain row, and then we want to find somewhere in the middle of kind of like our chain 2 / our double crochet at the end of our first row. So I just try and find 1 loop to put my needle through and pull that through, and I'm just working my needle front to back and then bringing it round to the front, and the next stitch is going to be at the top of the chain 2 or the double crochet. So how I kind of work this is I will work through one loop in between the stitch and then one loop through the top of the stitch. But realistically, as long as you match up the rows together, you should be fine. This is the kind of thing that as a beginner, I would really spend your time doing. So put on a nice TV show and just sit there. Maybe you could do a few rows at a time and just double check that everything lines up. And yeah, you just want to work your way up all the way till you reach the top of your panel. You'll also want to do the same thing with the top of either side of your collar, and this is going to be a little bit easier to sew together because you're just sewing together the top of each stitch. So remember that our turning chain counts as a stitch, so the second chain in the turning chain should be matched up with the last double crochet you did on the row, if that makes sense. But basically, when it comes to sewing, you can't do it too wrong as long as you try and match things up and make things look as even as they can. Also, I'm showing you here, make sure that your stitches aren't too loose, but also make sure that make sure that they're not super tight, that they kind of make the fabric have less movement or kind of bunch in certain areas. And I'm showing you here, this is how I finish off my sewing, but as long as you tie a secure knot, you should be more than fine. But I kind of fish my yarn through different loops and kind of pull them nice and tight, just so everything's nice and sturdy. Now you just want to go ahead and repeat this on the other side. At this point, you should have a completed garment. You want to go ahead and just try this on just to double check you're happy with everything. Obviously, you could go ahead and leave your project there, but my advice for you guys is that adding crochet borders, especially to garments, just makes everything look a lot cleaner. So to level up our crochet piece, we're going to do a little border before we continue. I tend to do this border with a slightly smaller hook. So for me, because I was using a 3.5mm hook, I'm going to go ahead and use a 3mm hook to do this. You want to make sure that you start this row wherever you can hide the best. So for me, I'm going to start by the seam of each side of the panel. So we're going to start off with a slip knot, and our first row is going to be of single crochets. So what I'm going to do is start by putting that slip knot on my hook, bringing that through, and if you can see, I'm not working into the double crochets rather than in between them. So I'm going to start by attaching that yarn again in between the double crochets, and that's where I'm going to do my first single crochet. So I'll be doing one single crochet in between each one of the double crochets for this part of my sweater vest. And obviously, if this isn't your thing, you could just work these stitches into the double crochet. I just think this makes your work look even more neat than if you're working into the stitches. But basically, you want to do this all the way up until you reach the curve or where you did your decreases. And around the chain 2 or the double crochet that's nearest the end, we're going to be doing 2 single crochets. So you can see here, I'm going to add 2 single crochets, then into the next one 2 single crochets, work up a row, 2 single crochets, and we're just going to continue like that. And you can see here that we have that mesh row, and we're just going to treat that as if there was no single crochet there, just to make things easier. So again, we're just going to do 2 single crochets around the chain 2 or the double crochet that's closest to us, working all the way around up until we reach where we started. And again, remember that we're going to be working in between the double crochets, not into the double crochets. And then once we reach the start of our row, we're going to slip stitch into the first stitch, chain 2, turn our work, and then I'm going to do 1 double crochet into each single crochet. And that's literally all the border is, but something as simple as this really elevates your work because it just makes all of your edges nice and neat, and it makes it look like you've put a lot more effort in, even though realistically this whole process didn't take me any more than an hour. I repeated this around the collar, around the waistband, as well as around the other sleeve, and I'm happy with how it looks now. At this point, we're going to try it on again, and hopefully you're happy with how everything's turned out. And unless you want to change anything, we're ready to go ahead and sew in all of our ends. So when it comes to sewing in ends, you want to make sure that the bad side of your work is facing you. And when it comes to actually sewing in your ends, you want to go ahead and pick a slightly smaller needle, because this time you will be working actually into the yarn, not just through kind of the loops around it. So I want to find a place where I can hide my yarn best. So for me at this point of my project, it's probably going to be this seam here that I'm starting off with. So what I'm going to do is just fish my hook through a few of the loops, maybe a centimetre or two, and then I'm going to pull my string through, and then going back obviously the opposite direction but through the same stitches, I'm gonna do the same thing. And I repeat this a total of 4 times, but each time I put my needle through, you should be not only going through the loops that you went through before, but you should also be going through the yarn that you have already put through the loops. Carrying the yarn through the center of other pieces of yarn just makes everything a lot more secure, so once you wash this, nothing will come undone. And that is our crochet sweater done. It's really cute and it's definitely a very versatile pattern. Obviously changing the yarn type, changing the amount of rows you do, or even introducing a new stitch could create a completely different effect. This is one of the things I talked about in my advice video for beginner crocheters, where if you have a pattern that you enjoy, you can tweak certain things to keep things exciting while still challenging yourself a little bit without frustrating yourself. And this is a good example of a pattern that you could just go ahead and change a few things to create a completely different effect with your garment without having to learn a completely new way of making a garment. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you like, comment and subscribe. Please check out all of my other social medias that I've linked down below, as well as my Etsy shop. Thank you for your support. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I will see you next week. Bye.